watching Outnumbered, and we are glad that you are. New concerns about what authorities are calling a growing trend in terror recruitment. It was breaking news yesterday at this time. The arrest of 6 Minnesota men accused of plotting to go to Syria so they could join ISIS. And the great fear, of course, is that they would come back here and wage jihad. 4 of them were arrested in Minnesota, 2 of them arrested in San Diego, and authorities say they were all friends and were drawn to terror by another friend who had apparently gone overseas and was staying in touch, encouraging them to join him in trying to help them. Law enforcement officials call it peer-to-peer recruitment. They say this, in their terms, new style of radicalization is very worrisome, and they expect to see a lot more of it. And this, as a new poll on the war on terror finds 39% of Americans say they think the terrorists are winning. That's up from 33% in the previous survey, the highest level of pessimism since the attacks of September 11th. Let's bring it out to the couch. All right, so, one of the points that we were talking about yesterday as this was breaking news is that for those of us who lived in Minnesota when they created these sort of neighborhoods and safe havens, if you will, for these kids from Somalia because they were coming from a war-torn country and so on and so forth, and they were having such a hard time assimilating, Guy, that the radicalization was on the horizon. We talked about it then, and that was a decade ago. And now we're seeing this come to fruition. Your thoughts about peer-to-peer recruitment?
Well, we've seen a few stories out of Minnesota specifically, but really all over the country. There are tens of thousands of Westerners who've traveled to the Islamic State, if we want to recognize that as sort of this amorphous country, if you will. At least 100, probably more, are Americans, with a lot more trying to get there. Now, I look at the story about peer-to-peer recruiting, and the other option of this is people being recruited as lone wolves online.
Right, that's what we've seen.
Right, which we've seen some of that. I do wonder if there's a silver lining, and maybe I'm reaching here, but when there's peer-to-peer interaction and recruitment, there are more people hearing about the recruitment. There are more potential data points for informants or the authorities to hear about or get wind of and cast a wider net and scoop up a bunch of people. So I'm trying to think of maybe a silver lining, although perhaps a stretch.
All right, so the backdrop of all of this today is what's happening up in Boston, because we've got Dzhokhar Tsarnaev in the sentencing hearing, life or death for him, and we know that his was a sibling situation. We've seen some cousins and siblings. There is the kind of train of thought, Rachel, that when people stick together, it's easier for them to kind of keep the Western world outside.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we talk a lot about immigration, but we have an immigration and assimilation problem. Like, who are we actually inviting to come to our country? Do they embrace our culture? And what are we doing as a culture to help them assimilate and feel more a part of this and not have that separation that you're talking about?
Is it our job? Solely? I mean,
sure. I think in our schools, listen, when my father was first generation to this country, he comes to this country, and the schools and all the civic and interactions that he had were all very pro-American. I think those things are gone, and so it's much easier for people who immigrate here to separate into their own fabric. Can I just add one more thing? If there were groups of young Catholic men going to Rome and joining a crusade, I guarantee you that the media and our government and this administration would be having a very different conversation. Not about this peer-to-peer thing, but really the root cause. What is it? It is reform in Islam, and it's also that Christianity needs to offer a more robust, manly, not feminized version of Christianity. And I think that's another topic. But it's a very interesting topic that I hope our Pope will address when he comes to that joint session of Congress in September instead of climate change, which is what I understand he wants to talk about.
Kennedy, I want to ask you about what Rachel's saying, though. I mean, is the onus really on us as Americans? I mean, when I go to another country, I try to learn their language. I try not to assimilate necessarily, because I only want to really live here.
But if you move
there,
you might think differently about assimilation.
Right.
And, it's the same thing when my mom came over from Romania when she was a kid. There wasn't a choice. You learned English, you learned about American society and culture, and, there's a very big difference between modern immigrants and ones who came over during the 20th century.
That's the point.
And I think
that's the point.
But I don't think that's the worst thing in the world, to learn about the place that you're moving instead of trying to wall yourself off.
It's one thing to welcome them with open arms, and I think that this administration has tried to do everything in its power to be politically correct, to not offend the Muslim faith. I think schools go out of their way. The difference is the mentality of the immigrants. When my father came here from Greece, he wanted to assimilate. A lot of cultures want to assimilate. I think the difference is you see a lot of these cultures, despite what schools are doing, despite what communities are doing, they don't want to be a part of the community. And you can't change their minds when they're that hell-bent.
And we weren't afraid to say that we were exceptional.
What was scary about Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is that he did assimilate. He played sports, he liked to party, and then look what he did.
And assimilated so much they put him on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine.
One of these 6 broke, though, and that's something that the U.S. government has to focus on, because they can do that again. If one had a break in conscience, they should figure out what that pattern is and break it up in the future.
And exploit that. All right, we'll report the news on that as it happens more. We're watching out for that Tsarnaev verdict as well in terms of the sentencing. Moving on. A U.S. warship now shadowing a convoy of ships from Iran, suspected of carrying weapons to the rebels in Yemen. Yes, I said Iran. Remember, we're trying to do a nuke deal with them. Could we be edging closer to a military showdown with Iran? And new questions about women in combat, the results of recent military physical testing, and whether standards should be changed for the women.